Hello, everybody. I see a great list of names here. It's very impressive, and I feel I'm among friends. If I hope I'm right in interpreting that, and it's really good to see you all and to get another chance to talk about the exhibition. And I've been invited to talk about my part of it because I was invited to the workshops that the Hunterian held in 2018, 2019. And that was just marvelous because I didn't quite know which way things were going. And when the organizers, as it were, the editors and authors of the exhibition gave me a potential subject, I had enough time to think about old ways, new roads beforehand that I was able to say, I don't really want to tackle that subject at all. I don't want to write about the arrival of the new roads and how they were built and all the rest of it. I thought it wasn't a subject that I knew so much about, but I thought that it was a well-published subject. And I didn't want to just find myself looking at the secondary literature and distilling it all into something new. So what had suggested to me was that with the old ways, new roads, which of course is very firmly on the front of the book, and attending the research seminars, it struck me that none of us were talking about the old ways. And yet it begged the question about, well, what were the old ways? But what had, I suppose, taken our attention was that old ways, new roads was a sort of trope that had come out of the literature, that before the new roads, the Highlands were, if you like, a trackless waste, that roads didn't exist, and that it was General Wade and his successors to whom we owed the road system and so on. And of course, the old ways, new roads was suggested by Edmund Burt in Burt's letters. In his letter to his friend in London, he had described the Highlands, summed up the Highlands as, as more or less the trackless waste. And so what we find, and I find this is worrying in, if you like, popular histories, in school textbooks and so forth, any account of the 18th century and the opening up of the Highlands comes with the comment that before General Wade and Caulfield and his successors built the roads, the military roads, there were no roads. And so I felt this was the idea, the concept tackle, that we would look back and see what was there beforehand. And particularly if we then establish a concept and a norm that, yes, there were roads all over the Highlands of one sort or another, and I would want to address who used them, who used these roads, where were they, why were they being used, and how were they being used? Because I thought, well, if there's one thing I could do after a part career in the National Museums and in the Agricultural Museum, the Department of Ethnology, I would want to try to tackle the idea of the material culture of transport. If you had to get from A to B with a load, what did you do? And how did you carry things and so forth? So I would like to think that my chapter is important because it looks, as you're seeing at this handy illustration, that of course there were roads and of course there were people who were using them, and we can even get some idea of how they were being used. So this is a famous, well, to me famous, and it is repeated in the book, illustration from Burt's letters from the north of Scotland, and it shows three items of transport, three road practices, if you like, three different groups of people. And in fact, what I have shown in very brief order is that these different forms of transport, at the top a sledge, in the middle what's called a rung cart, and in the bottom a basket cart, which has a particular Gaelic name, Lopan, or Cliav, creel. As you can see, a creel in the cart behind the pony's rump. That these were not just caricatures, but really quite useful and accurate depictions of how and why people used the road systems in the Highlands in the old days. So a very useful illustration, and one that has lots of meaning, and particularly what I think I was trying to show, that if we take as a starting point Gaelic language and letters and the information available through Gaelic, these items leap into life, so to speak. So I've tried to do that in my chapter. Well, in looking at the old ways, it was very obvious, I suppose it's obvious to all of us, that that the Highlanders were very mobile. They moved around a huge amount, everyone did. And the idea of the mountains being impassable and the lowlands being impassable because they were boggy was just part of the bad press of the Enlightenment. The improvers, it was in the interest of the improvers and writers and enlightened people, folk of the 18th century, to make out that they couldn't move around in the Highlands because of these problems, and that with the new order, everything was different. So, of course, everyone moved around. And what I've done in my chapter is to look at, to try and group the activities into some sort of sensible and intelligible order. So, looked a bit at what, if you like, the norm of life in the Highlands, where I've looked at townships and how townships arranged themselves and related to each other, and how people moved between townships, and also to remind ourselves that with each township was a network of roads that went up into the hills for the summer grazings. And so the sheilings were as much a part of the road system and the tracks and the old ways. And these survive in different ways. They survive in the sense that you can spot them on Google Earth, as I found, and you can see where the roads went, and they might even have Gaelic names that survive from the old days. So usually what happens is that the roads to the sheilings have been overtaken by new roads or different roads, but sometimes they survive under the tarmac. So that's townships and sheilings and the links between them. The other thing which I wanted to flag up in my chapter was how people in the Highlands would have perceived their countryside, because it had struck me, since we've had our MSc master's program at Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, that there was a different way of looking at things. And I found that in Skye, round about Sabhal Mòr Ostaig. But equally, if you look at Blau's Atlas of 1654, it is, as it were, as though the countryside is perceived differently. And one glaring issue from my point of view is that if you look at the pages, the sheets of Blau's Atlas, and obviously based on some of Pont's work and Robert Gordon's work, that these show, if you like, a big gap where the A9 now goes, so that we look at the map today and we perhaps perceive in a very broad brush way that that going north, you go to Stirling or Perth, and you head up north out the A9, you get to Inverness. But so if you start off, if you like, on that axis to look at the map, when you look at Blau's Atlas, well, the axis is going the other way. It's at almost at 90 degrees. The lines of movement and communication and the lines of settlement are on more of an east-west, west-east axis. So I think from that, and I haven't done any more work on that, but I get the feeling that the A9 is what the way we have it today is that you're passing through classic shieling country, that it's upland grazings. And I know my colleagues on Old Ways, New Roads, and I see Christopher here, would give me a more detailed view of what that land was used for up between, where are we? Well, I'm basically Pitlochry and Blair Athol and Dalwhinnie and Newton Moor. So anyway, townships and shillings, and then I look at trade routes, and I decided to look at an area of the country that I thought wasn't particularly covered by the new roads to begin with, because, and when you look at tourist traffic in the 18th and early 19th century, very few of them took their journeys up north of the Great Glen and up into Ross-shire and Ross and Cromarty and Sutherland and Caithness. So I took that area and looked at roads and road systems in north of the Great Glen and found it really incredibly impressive, with the number of old ways, the number of routes that people took going north, south, east, and west. And almost I took as what was symbolic to me as a starting point was the status of Poolew, the port and township of Poolew at the end of Loch Maree, at the west end of Loch Maree. And to see that up to the early 18th century, Poolew was the big clearinghouse for traffic coming from the Hebrides into the north of Scotland, well, indeed into the west of Scotland. And so Poolew was very, very important, and it was famous for a annual, or maybe it happened several times a year, but an annual event, the the Poolew Fair, where all the trading took place, and a lot of cattle were traded too, I'm sure. So I took that as a symbol of how things have changed, because of course with the British Fisheries Society establishing the port of Ullapool just to the north of Poolew on Loch Broom in whenever it was, the 1780s, it eclipsed that former route and that former old way, and Poolew fell into a sort of backwater. So that I thought took as a symbol, but also there were, wherever there was a way, reasonable way, east to west, west to east, there was an old way, an old track, an old road. And for example, well, I mentioned the main glens of Strathglass, Strath-Eric, and up north, where the roads and sake were coming from Kintail and Poolew and so forth, and they all crossed from west to, mainly from west to east and east to west. So trade and commerce was an interesting one. And in looking at trade and commerce, I suggested that there was if you like, a sort of landscape of belief, a spiritual landscape before that, which was recorded through saints' names and Coffin Roads. And one of the pictures that I was very keen to get into my chapter was the picture of a so-called Coffin Road. This picture, which I know this particular spot, and I felt that it was an important picture taken by M.E.M. Donaldson in 1904, 1905, and it shows the coffins sites, the coffin cairns on the old road from Glenuig to Kinloch Moydart in Moydart, where a coffin road, or a road by which the populace carried their dead to the burial place, in this case St. Finan's Island on Loch Shiel, where customarily people stopped to rest the coffins because they were carrying them overland, and the tradition is that where the coffin was laid down, you raised a cairn on that very spot. And this is this wonderful group of cairns on that above the road there, well, on the road itself, but the road has been replaced by a new road in the 1960s, a so-called new road. And these cairns have largely disappeared, I'm sorry to say. But you can see how these commemorate a spiritual landscape, how they commemorated the links between settlements and burial places and holy places, and part of the network of ways and old ways and ways of life, if you like, that were common up to modern times, quite modern times. There is two sets, I can think of two sets of burial cairns call them resting cairns beside the road from Malig to Fort William. Just as you get to Lochielt, there is a set of resting cairns on the north side of the road. And when you're driving from Fort William to Spian Bridge, there's 3 resting cairns beside the road on the north side of the road there, which were raised really quite late in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. So this is not a forgotten tradition, but these resting cairns are very much under threat by modern movement. So just to round off what I'm saying, I look at other aspects of the old ways. I talk about cattle raiding, because you've got to talk about cattle raiding. There's so much part of the picture. And also the movement of cattle and trade in the drove roads. And there's a bit of a discussion in my chapter on drove roads. Also, just to suggest that for our information on drove roads, we all go to A.R.B. Haldane's book, The Drove Roads of Scotland. But that was published as long ago as 1952. And what I found that I inherited when I was a student was a concept of a system of roads that was more or less fixed. And when you looked at Haldane's useful map at the end of his book, here you had the system of roads. And what I suggested in my chapter was that this notion of a fixity in a network is being challenged these days, and can be challenged in different ways. So that's important too, and we should bear that in mind. So I looked at just armies moving around, I say cattle raiding, and there's some interesting topics there. For example, there was in traditional lore, there was a road that went from, at least there was a concept of a road that went from the Lochaber down to the Braes of Angus and Eastern Perthshire. And it was called Raat na Merloch, the road of the thieves or brigands. But when you then get into detail, you find that if you were an active brigand or Cearnoch or Cataran, as it is in Scots, in the 15th and 16th, 17th centuries, you made very sure that if you took one road one way, you came back a different way. So again, not such a fixity of ways, but more contributing to the idea that the whole of the Highlands were covered by a network of very busy roads or tracks. And that this is important to bear in mind, and perhaps a notion that gets lost over time. When I started my essay, I thought, well, what do I know of the old ways? And I thought, well, there's a lovely song called The Road to the Isles, and it's familiar to us all, and it's a Marjorie Kennedy Fraser gem, if you like. And when I went to look at the text and then put it on the map, so to speak, I could see that the suggestion was that this is indeed an old road, that an old way by, I think that the line is by heather tracks and moorland, whatever, but you get the meaning. and that it went from, as we know, from Loch Rannoch and to Loch Arbor, and that way is well marked by a particular pass through the Ben Nevis Massif, and it coming out at roughly Spian Bridge, and then going on west by Mora to the sea. I can almost sing it. So there was an old way that's perhaps still with us, but when you perhaps look at it in detail, it's not such a fixed way. And the other thing that struck me, that in the Gaelic perception of this old way, it was perhaps seen as going the other way. It was seen as going from west to east, whereas the modern song is from us going from east to west. So that's part of just the kind of twist to the tale, and that we should bear in mind. So how were the roads used? And just finished off my essay with one or two pictures which I discussed, and one of the very special ones for me was the Paul Sandby picture. One of the Paul Sandby pictures, or at least after Paul Sandby, one of the very important elements of the new ways and new roads were the surveyors who came with General Wade and General Caulfield and the whole military system, because they left some fantastic evidence. And this is one of the drawings made by one of Paul Sandby, one of the surveyors, group of young surveyors, of things that they saw on the way. And one might say, why has he drawn this person with her heavy load? And you imagine, because it's different from what he was used to if he'd come up from England, so on. So the Sandby drawings are really wonderful, and they also key in beautifully with the Gaelic evidence. Here is a woman carrying a creel. I would say that she's carrying either bedding for cattle, or she's carrying fodder for cattle. And either way, it's a big burden, but it doesn't seem to be that heavy. She's not bowed under the load. So, we must use the evidence as the draftsman has given it to us. Also, the details of her dress are very good, according to what we know in Gaelic about clothing and so forth. The way she's wearing a white pinny on the front, and she's got that is a kind of overskirt that she's wearing, which takes the load of the creel on her back. And so generally it's very good information. And as you can see, this is a willow creel, a creel made of willow work. And so everything is right about that picture. Also, I would say another thing we take away from it, this is a married woman, not a young girl. And it also perhaps alludes to the fact that the handling of animals on a daily basis was very often the women's responsibility. So this is a married woman with a responsibility for the animals under her charge, and she's looking after either, I reckon it's probably fodder as opposed to bedding. If it was bedding, it would look a bit rougher than what it looks. It would be bracken or straw or something like this, or rushes. I think possibly we might well have hay in there. So there we are. And just to take that on, perhaps just to have one more look at the Bert's letters, black and white picture again. My essay, my chapter finishes with some details about these different forms of transport. In other words, to explain that without the Gaelic information, it may be that Bert's cartoons, Bert's drawings just remain as caricatures or cartoons. In other words, this was to tell his readership that how old-fashioned things were in the Highlands. And, if you want some examples, just look at this, boys and girls. But in fact, it's all explained in Gaelic, and the whole thing comes to life with the language and literature. So that's really my chapter, and I'd be very pleased to have any chat about it, or if there are any questions, or if you want any more insight into any particular bits and pieces in what I've mentioned.